This is great. Well, welcome, folks. Welcome. I see some familiar people, some friends and fans. It's good to see you. Wow, Scott, I haven't seen you in a moment.
I've been in hiding. Good to see you too, Carlos. Hey, Haley.
You've been in the lab.
That's right.
The venture lab. Oh my gosh. I saw someone did something really clever the other day. They did like a kid survivor of dad jokes, and they play like the really somber music, and the kids are like, I was sitting having dinner and then my dad said this, and then the narrator goes, and the kid never liked Brussels sprouts again. Something like that, because the dad made some really just horrible dad joke. So that was a little bit of that.
Dad jokes were the best jokes.
To see everyone. Francis and Megan. All right. Yeah, it's going to be an intimate fireside or campfire side chat. So, like they always say, the people that show up are the right people, So, yeah. Thanks, Haley, for putting it together. I mean, from just the Mizzen side, Kristen and Haley, appreciate y'all taking a moment to do this. Things like this, they, especially during the summer's become such a crazy season. It used to be that summer was a little bit of like a lull where you can recover, rejuvenate, but we're going right into it nowadays. And summer programming is just massive all across the country. So thanks for taking time to have this type of intimate setting where it's a little bit of a fishbowl experience with my colleague, Richard. I'm looking forward just to hearing from him. I am a student in this thing. I am a learner in the storytelling and identity work. And I can't wait to have you all hear more about that work from Richard. So thanks, Richard, for being a part of this and sharing your story and your expertise.
Yeah, excited to share more and learn about some of you too.
Yeah. So it is 9:03, folks. So we are officially on. The campfire is on. Okay. It's funny, you're going to crack up at this, but Richard and I coordinated. We're like, Richard, you got to wear something campy, something outdoorsy. So we put on some, I'm not wearing this flannel in ages. I'm what they say, I'm fronting, or I don't wear this all the time. Okay. In case you're wondering, I haven't worn this flannel in a minute. So we color coordinated. I told Richard I brought the light down a little bit, not so bright, and then I have my Yeti coffee mug. I was gonna dig in and try and, I don't know, Richard, if you got some like campy, like kitchenwares, that you I don't know if you do that kind of thing. You just use the same dishes that you have at home and you just take them with you camping, or if you have a special set just for camping.
Yeah, no, I would have just pulled out a random cup from the cupboard.
Nice. Well, folks, thanks for joining us. I think what we're going to do, if this is okay, just for all of us to get to know each other. After all, we're all around a campfire. It'd be weird if someone just sat down and you didn't find out who that was that just showed up at your campfire. So I'd love for us to just do a quick 20-second hello. Let us know where you're from, program. And I don't know, let's see here. What is the one thing you like to do when you go outdoors, right? When you're sitting outdoors, what is the thing you like to do? Is it contemplate? Is it fish? Is it eat? Is it throw rocks? Like, what do you like to do when you're outdoors? All right, so I'll model this for us, and then I'll kick it over to Richard. My name is Carlos Santini. I'm the CEO of an organization by the name of Mizzen. We design and provide free out-of-school time teaching and learning resources for practitioners all around the country, free of charge. And some of our great partners are here, including Scott from Venture Lab. I stole your introduction. Sorry, Scott, but very proud to be here. And one of the things I love when I'm outdoors, I actually like to skip. I just said it, I like to skip rocks. If I'm by a body of water and I find the perfect smooth stone, I try and show up to my kids. Sometimes I throw my arm out, but that's one of my favorite things to do. So Richard, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Carlos. Good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Reyes, the founder and executive director at the Plus Me Project, based here in Los Angeles. I'll share more very soon, but outdoors, in the camping environment, I like to sit fireside, chat. I'm not big on like the hiking and the whole exploring the outdoors, so I need to do more of that. But yeah, that's a little bit about my outdoor hiking life that doesn't exist. Go to someone else who wants to share.
Yeah, jump on in, folks. Don't be shy.
I'll go ahead and share super quickly. We actually work with Mizzen, which is super exciting, but I wanted to hop on because I've heard a little bit about the Plus Me project. My dad is former LAPD and he did a lot with youth in general. So I just wanted to hear more and see if maybe I can tell him about it and get some speaking going.
Awesome. And what org or project are you with, Brianna?
Chameleon.
Oh, you're with Chameleon Crew.
Yes.
Oh, nice. Okay, so I probably met you and I forgot. I got caught. I walked into that one. Excellent.
And then in terms of camping, anything eating related, I'm more than happy to do it.
Awesome. Let's keep the popcorn going, folks. Whoever wants to join in. And again, thank you, Haley. If you just want to share on chat, cool, you can do that too. But just jump in. Francis, I think you're ready.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Francis Vasquez with ASAP Connect. I know Richard from my previous life as a board member there, so big fan. What I love to do, camping or outdoors, just hiking, but I hate the bugs that like to eat me. So I have those little nets that go around and all that stuff to try to keep them away from me.
I'm with you. The minute those bugs come by, you turn into a karate master the minute those bugs come by. Thank you, Francis. All right, folks, jump on in. Who's next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan. Oh, sorry, Janine.
Go, Megan.
So you're spotlighting. Great minds think alike. I'm Megan. I'm a consultant at Mizzen. It's been such a pleasure to just work with an incredible group of people and all of their partners and all of the Mizzen members on the platform as well. And I'm just loving every second of it. When I'm camping, I love anything related to the water. So even if it's just lying there on a floaty or going kayaking, just as long as there's a body of water, I am happy as a fish. Nice to meet everyone.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you. All right, Scott talks about hammock time. Yeah, that's good. Okay, folks, we'll give one more person a chance to do it verbally, and for the rest of us, we can just throw our names in the chat, and if you can answer the question around your name, your org, the city you're coming in from, and one of your favorite outdoorsy things to do. Yeah. So one more person that's jump in verbally if you'd like. If not, we'll keep moving.
I can jump in. I'm Janine. I'm the operations manager at Mizzen. And when I am camping, I actually love to backpack. So I love to camp in the backcountry and watch the stars. That's my favorite thing to do.
Awesome. Thank you. And yeah, Joshua Tree is a good place to watch stars. That's if you're wondering what those trees are behind you, behind her, those are yucca. Those are officially called yucca trees, right?
Yeah. In Joshua Tree, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very famous state park in California. So folks, thanks for joining us. And I'm really excited here to kick off our session together around storytelling and identity and the relationship between the two, how they work, and how can they be a part of our work as practitioners, as leaders in the out of school time summer learning space. And so I'm really honored to be able to have Richard join us to talk about the idea of storytelling. After all, that's something that I've been picking up and learning from him over the many years since we met. I think 2017, 2016, around there, when we teamed up to do an overnight youth leadership experience with students from the After School All-Stars, where Haley, Kristen, myself come from, and we had the honor and pleasure of doing a summer experience around leadership, and storytelling was a big part of it. So to start off this idea of storytelling, obviously I'm going to be in a position of talking to Richard sharing his expertise and experience, and then for myself to be able to connect what I've learned from storytelling. And I welcome the rest of you to think about the concept of storytelling in your own personal and professional lives and how you've seen it develop. What are questions that you have around it as you hear Richard? But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Richard by telling a story. And I'm going to ask him a question: why storytelling? And so one of the things that I love to do is to go to Mammoth Lakes, which is in the Eastern Sierras. It's a very famous ski resort and mountain. Some of the most beautiful mountain backdrops are in Mammoth Lakes. And the Eastern Sierras are revered in the state of California for their beauty, and some of the hiking trails, the Pacific Coast Trail that goes from the border of Mexico all the way to Canada and back. It goes through Mammoth Lakes, and so it's a beautiful, beautiful place. But in the early 1900s, there was a let's see here, how do I pronounce this? A hydrographer, and a hydrographer just studies hydrology and the accumulation of water in any specific area. And this particular gentleman by the name of Dave McCoy was doing some work in the Eastern Sierras, just tracking water and water collection. And then he found this place in the Eastern Sierras, and he realized that there was more water accumulating in this area than in any other place he'd seen. So as a scientist, he went back to his wife and said, you know what? I'm going to quit my job. We're going to sell everything we have, and we're going to start a ski resort in this little place that I found called Mammoth Lakes. I don't know if that was called Mammoth Lakes back then, probably just Mammoth Mountain. So his wife probably thought he was crazy. And he did just that, sold everything. And he started a very simple, I think they called it like it wasn't a donkey, but it was an engine that just might as well was as strong as a single donkey that pulled you up the slope and kind of let you drop down into the mountain and ski. So this very simple, this hydrographer was the actual founder of Mammoth Lakes, and he gave everything up because he found this special place. So I share this story because, Richard, I'm curious, you yourself personally discovered this idea of storytelling, and I would imagine it started with yourself. So if you can talk to us a little bit about like this little bit of gold that you found, right? Much like Dave McCoy and Mammoth Lakes, he found this thing. He's like, there's something here. Tell us a little bit about just storytelling in general and your experience in launching this in your own personal life and how that became the Plus Me Project.
Yeah, for sure. So it kind of all goes back to when I discovered I had a story, and it wasn't honestly until college where I made that connection, you know. So I went through my youth years, middle school, high school, community college, not really thinking that I had been through much in my life. And I transferred into Occidental College. And as a transfer student, I entered that space not knowing anybody. I lived off campus to save money with my grandma. So I was the new kid on campus that really wasn't involved. And Oxy is such a small community. Everyone seems to know each other. But there was one day where I would get to class early, and I was used to always arriving early. But at Occidental College, you don't get to class early because it's so small and you walk in when you're supposed to walk in. So I got to class 20 minutes early on this day, and I sit down at my desk, and 10 minutes later, these two girls walk in and they're sitting talking to each other. And finally, one girl turns to me and she says, "Hey, like, who are you? We know everyone here at Oxy. How come we don't know who you are?" And I was like, "Oh, me? Oh, my name's Richard. You know, I grew up 5 minutes down the road. I didn't do well in high school, so I went to community college. And while I was there, my lung collapsed 3 times. And I actually applied to Oxy last semester. I got rejected, but I'm a new CTSJ major. It's nice to meet you." And the girls kind of looked at each other and they're like, "Oh my God, that's such a cool story, dude. It's so good to meet you." And just hearing that, right? That's such a cool story. It was something that allowed me to actually like pause in that moment and be like, oh, wow, like maybe this isn't normal. Maybe this is unique. Maybe this is a story that not everyone experiences, that shows my resilience. And I kind of sat with that for a while and started thinking about what was my story of getting into Occidental as a first-generation college student. What were some of those obstacles I encountered through just kind of a journaling process of just reflecting on my life. And then I reached out to my high school teacher, my leadership advisor, and I said, "I'd love to share my story of how I got into Oxy with your students." And she agreed, and sharing that story probably back in 2010 as the first time was what started this whole journey of me discovering the power of personal narrative storytelling. Not only being that role model that I never felt I had to model what a story can look, sound, and feel like, But then years later, understanding that while stories will inspire us and hopefully motivate and we can learn, a lot of us just don't necessarily have the tools, the resources, or are given the space to do that self-reflection, to find what our stories are and to connect through community. So really built the Plus Me project over the past decade, centered on personal storytelling and bringing in speakers to share, but more importantly, providing the framework and the support to help youth and adults understand they have a story, their stories matter, and those stories can get them into the college of their dreams or land a job they're passionate about, or just build stronger connections with those around them.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. And for folks who are kind of like just kind of taking that in, kind of hang on to this question and maybe you can give us your interpretation of this. But Richard, you talked about the idea of storytelling, or how you've seen storytelling is a way to connect to community and then reflect on experiences. What are other, and for the audience, if you can let us know kind of what you think storytelling is from your perspective in our chat. But Richard, what else, how else would you define or describe the art of storytelling?
Yeah, I think, storytelling can be so vast, right? And we have so many different mediums of how you can tell stories. And I think I come to this lens as a first person storyteller. So thinking about your narrative and you being able to own that. So I think when you're able to discover and share your story, you're often able to build confidence in yourself. You're able to not only connect, but you then can, showcase vulnerability and have that human experience where if we're really able to tap into our emotions and our thoughts, and we're able to talk about how you were earlier sharing that story and kind of painting the scene with the setting and being able to tap into different information, it can transform others as well as yourself as you are kind of growing. I think storytelling can also help a lot with mental wellness and being able to, storytelling is reflecting and then sharing out. And when you're constantly able to share out parts of your story, you understand that resilience. You understand that you're not alone often, especially when it's done in community. So I think, as a storyteller, you're able to understand you're the protagonist of your story. You're the narrator, and you ultimately decide where it's going to go. And I think that can be very empowering as well for youth and adults as they think about the next chapter in their journey.
Yeah. And Richard, Scott, I'm going to invite you to the campfire conversation, brother. So, get a little closer to the campfire here and tell us a little bit about this idea of self-acceptance and self-exploration, because what I've been learning about storytelling is it is a bit of like a therapy and a real sense of like, what have I been through? And I had a chance to actually write my story down, share it with others. So it was so raw and so intense that even like and I'll be honest, my family members, and Richard and I had this experience, they had a difficult time in me sharing my story because our story had been so private up to that point that when it got out, I had to actually have conversations with siblings around this idea of accepting self and what is the exploration of self. So if you can expand a little bit, Scott, on that concept for yourself.
Yeah, both personally, and then I'm always shifting that lens from kind of the adult, the educator, me, but also the students. And just when you ask someone to talk about themselves and you show that interest, a student will open up like, oh, they actually care about me. They want to hear my story. And so they may have never had that moment of, well, like you said, Richard, what is my story? And I love that idea of scaffolding that expression and what does the arc look like? How do I speak about myself kindly and maybe critically at times? It's just extremely validating for someone to know that another person wants to hear it, that will invest the time, that most valuable of resources to listen and then help them get that story out. And that's where the connection piece comes in.
Thank you, Scott. And yes, I mean, storytelling is a very subjective, personal thing that just you're able to draw that out. And Richard, there's a question here around, when you realize you had a story, what are some of the tools or resources that you were able to use to start sharing your story? And I know that from the Plus Me project, what I learned a lot about and helped me articulate my story was that there was a sequence or a structure within the storytelling work. And so if you can share a little bit about just that and maybe answer the question around what other tools or resources helped you before you discovered Plus Me, right? That you were able to go, all right, let me use this stuff to kind of tell my story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, truthfully, when I first was putting my story together, I didn't have many resources or support. It was kind of like me thinking just about, okay, well, if I shared this part with this one girl who then said, you have a cool story, what are the other parts? So I kind of just sat down with myself and in a journal and just started writing. What were those memories that came up? What were those moments? And I pieced my story together, and sharing at North Hollywood High School was the first time, but then I was able to, in my senior year of college, visit 77 schools and speak to almost 13,000 students. And by sharing my story over and over again and engaging with youth, I was able to understand what connected more with students. What did they like hearing? What kind of brought them in? And by constantly adjusting and changing what stories I would share, I understood more of a framework model, right? So then when I began training other facilitators or other guest speakers to go in and share their stories, and then when we ultimately started building our curriculum that's delivered for youth and adults, I had this strong understanding of being able to break down your story into elements, right? So elements that we've learned growing up in school, but being able to provide a scaffolding approach of questions and exercises that help bring that story out. So at Plus Me, we have our My Story Matters journal. And the reason we created this journal, which is a 100-page personal narrative guide that guides that whole self-reflection process, is it didn't exist. There wasn't that tool for middle and high school youth to really find their story in a structured format that can lead to that college personal statement that we were able to find maybe 7 years ago when we first put it together. So we built that, and we've been able to go through multiple versions where we know this format of characters, settings, struggles, accomplishments, lessons can guide that process. And it can be done in a way where you're also slowly increasing gradient over time, right? So if you think about what is my story and you're asked, like, what's the biggest challenge you've overcome? And it's just like, oh my gosh, like, where do I even start? It can be very maybe triggering. So let's back up and let's go into maybe more questions that can maybe be easier for us to answer. You know, who is someone who helped raise you? Who is your best friend? What school did you go to in elementary school? Just to ask these questions that start to piece your story together and help people that maybe don't think they have a story understand you have a narrative, and let's find that together.
Yeah, it's you know, Janine brought up something in the chat that talked about she always saw storytelling as not necessarily your own story, but the story of others and the story of events. And so what I experienced in my storytelling kind of journey is that there were people, including family members and people that were really close to me, that didn't know things about me because I'd never really told it. And that was one of the things that even with my own family, like my other sister, she wasn't as thrown back by it. She just looked at me, she said, I never knew you were going through that. And we were siblings living under the same roof. But because the story was so personal and I never shared it, because I felt it was something that I had to carry just individually. It wasn't until I was able to put it to story that my sister said, I did not know that you were looking at life that way. So perspective is something in terms of experiences, setbacks, that I never really shared my perspective on those things. And so I'd be curious from the audience here is there a perspective that you've kind of had as a person on your own life that you put out, that you come in contact with, or that you shared and people have said, oh, I did not know that you were looking at life that way, or you were experiencing life that way? And so, Richard, I don't know, when you looked at your own personal story, and as you've been hearing the stories of both adults and youth, how is that, how are you seeing that idea of perspective, right? When folks are sharing life from their vantage point, like, what have you noticed?
Yeah, no, I think the biggest thing that sticks out is we have to do the self-reflection ourselves as individuals. And when it's done in community, it provides that maybe awareness. So for example, when I thought about my story, like I didn't learn till I was in middle school that I would hopefully become a first generation college student. So that being an identity of mine, had I not been given a homework assignment to go home and ask my grandparents and parents where they went to college, I may not have known that. And then that is a piece of my story that then has shaped so much of what's come after that. Another piece that kind of has come up is, sharing with youth. Like a lot of times when we would start our curriculum and when we would get into struggles, I noticed a lot of them would post on some of our activities around dealing with alcoholism in their family or drug addictions in their family. And it wasn't until like I was able to process that for my life, dealing with family members that had drug addictions or alcohol abuse and how that then impacted me. It allowed me to open up and be more vulnerable and expose that earlier on, which then was able to support youth and maybe feeling like, okay, this is maybe also true about me. This is something I can share. I'm not the only one going through this, so it can take off some of those weights that we put on our shoulders. But yeah, that's kind of, I think, something that comes up when we allow ourselves the space to reflect. And then when we're in community and we hear it from others, it grants us permission sometimes to go there. When maybe we didn't think it was acceptable or appropriate to share some of these more personal things with others.
Yeah, and I think that's related even to the question here that Haley's asking around breaking through the fear of sharing our story publicly, right? What are some things that you've been able to hang on to or use to kind of break through that fear? So Richard, I don't know if there's anything specific that comes to mind with because it seems like when you shared your story with those students from Oxy, I'm sure they didn't expect all of that when they first asked you. And it just kind of like came out just very naturally in conversation. And so is that a gift that you have, that you're able to just be very candid and tell your story? Or did you have to build to that point where you could be courageous in sharing elements of your story? What was that experience like for you? And what can you share with folks about how they can break through some of that fear?
Yeah, no, well, I'm an introvert. So I'm an introverted extrovert where it's not easy for me to network and talk to people and open up. And in that moment, right, I have no idea how that just came out. It was just kind of like, oh, you're asking a little bit about me. These are 3 facts that maybe were top of mind that I shared. But it's been, 12, 13 years of sharing my story, a lot of it being the same story over and over again, to where I became more and more comfortable sharing parts of that. And when I think about other identities that I have, it's like there are some that took even more time for me to be comfortable sharing in my story, being able to acknowledge, accepting of myself. So I think it genuinely does take time, and all of us are different with our level of comfort in engaging with others and being vulnerable. But what I think happens is when you're in a space where you are able to experience the power of personal storytelling and you're able to see the transformation that can happen, it can really, I think, empower others to continuously go there, right? So the more that I model, the more that I'm willing, it's helping others in community. And I think that that's something that I would just encourage. Continue to step into your vulnerability. And it's scary, right? Your heart may pound, you may get those butterflies, but if you're not modeling, who is? And if no one is, then we're not connecting as a society and getting to know each other and really, talking about real things that are on our hearts and minds. And if we do it through our personal experiences and our stories, it can just make the world a better place genuinely. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you, Richard. And yes, folks, I mean, if someone would like to share a moment of courage that they experienced, maybe that point where you look back and you go, I remember when I stepped into my story, whether it was in a conversation with one person or in a small group or in a larger group setting, if someone can share a moment where you broke through that fear and you told your story. And I'll say this, right? How many great stories have we missed out on by this very bad habit that we have as a society when people ask, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. right? The I'm fine response. I wonder how many great stories and moments of connection were missed because of the I'm fine response. So maybe one of y'all can share a moment where you didn't go there, right? Where you didn't go, I'm fine, but you actually said, you know, I'm going through something, or I've got something to share, right?
I'll jump in. I think those are the most vulnerable moments, right? And you know that there's a moment where you need to share because someone else in the audience really needs to hear it. And I think for me, just growing up, it was a challenge being raised by two strong Latina women, my grandmother, my mother. And, you know, one of the things I did sign up for that made me a total wreck, and I've worked with youth my entire life, was the March Madness Sharing Your Story with Plus Me, and being terrified to share it with junior high kids because I had no relationship with them, and coming in and having to do it over Zoom. But just sharing the story that I didn't learn to read until junior high, that always terrifies me. And I'm always like, I love to share, I love to talk to people, I love all that stuff, but I also need to plan and prepare for it. And so being with them, sharing that story, being super nervous because I want to do a really good job, and I want them to know that no matter what they don't know, you know, what they don't understand, they can overcome it and stuff. But I get super nervous and I talk so fast that I think we're given like 4 minutes to share what the main points are, and then I'm done in 2 minutes because I'm just terrified of what these middle school students are going to think of right after they say. And you know, when you debrief, they're like, you know, they connect with you and it's great. But I think for me, my struggle is that I get so nervous. I want to do a good job. I want them to know that they can overcome anything, but I also I just speak really fast.
Yeah, Francis, what a great thing to say, because it does cover a little bit of even what Janine said around how our youth dealing with sharing their story, how they're receiving it. Do they feel weird? There's this thing, Richard, that I've seen in your work where the storytelling community or aspect is it connects and bridges generations, right? Older to younger, kids to adults. And what Francis is saying is absolutely true. And I'll share, I had an experience, and I don't know, Richard, if you were with us for this one time that we did some work at UCLA, and we had Patrick Mahomes as a guest. So if y'all don't know who Patrick Mahomes is, he's not just the guy from State Farm, you know, Patrick my homie, but he's also the Super Bowl winning quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs. And I think Haley's a fan of Patrick Mahomes. I think sort of. But so he was a guest, and I was on stage with him, and he was genuinely nervous about talking to middle and high school youth, because as adults, one of the things that we struggle with is the idea of like rejection, because we're older. Are we relevant? Are they going to be hip with what we have to say? And I think, Richard, what I've really seen that's beautiful is the idea that storytelling connects and bridges generations, so that youth can be, you know, older and younger folk can be in the same room, share stories and connect to each other. So what has been the experience, Richard, in storytelling connecting generations and having a common sense of like, we have something in common, we have something to share? I mean, what's been your experience in that generational connection?
Yeah, you know, it's been fun being able to create those spaces, and it's been challenging to get us all to understand that we have a story that's worth sharing. So there are so many adults that we interact with, that we try to recruit as volunteers, that sign up, and then it's just this, my story is not going to connect with these kids, right? My story isn't of value, my story isn't. And it's like, no, your story is. No matter what you've gone through, as long as you're willing to go through this process with us and you're willing to do some internal reflection, you have a story that can connect with youth. Because at the end of the day, as humans, we've all struggled. We've all had accomplishments. We just have to find those moments and be willing to share them. And when we're willing to be vulnerable and talk about whatever it is, there is someone in the audience, a youth that either is going through the exact thing or can completely connect because they get it, right? You're being vulnerable. You're talking about your emotions in a way that not a lot of adults come into youth's lives to do. So, I didn't have a relatable role model. There weren't people ever telling me about what they were struggling with and how they navigated these roadblocks. And I kind of had to feel like I figured it out on my own, which luckily happened. But what would it look like if we had a society that understood every person has a story to belong in this world? And if you share that, you can be that inspiration to others. And likewise, there are youth that are sharing stories with these adults that can inspire them as well, so it's not just a one-sided engagement. Our stories are universal and they can connect from both ends as long as we have, again, the space and the tools to do that.
Yeah, and I think you said something, Richard. There was a key term in there, the word belonging. And so we know that there is they're closely related, the idea of storytelling and identity development. Because in these last couple of years, and I actually just had a chance to lean into my story and my identity at a keynote that I did for the folks in Texas a couple of weeks ago. And I've been able to get more in touch with my identity, my past as an immigrant, try to even fill some holes in my story that I was just having a hard time recollecting, and then building my identity from there. So what is that relationship between identity development and storytelling? How are those two connected in your mind?
Yeah. I think when we think about storytelling and the personal narrative of breaking down these elements and reflecting on these moments that stick out in our lives, identities are uncovered, right? So there are different identities that maybe are more, we embrace more or are known for whatever reason. And there are these identities within ourselves that either we didn't know, we didn't want to accept, we didn't want to embrace. And storytelling helps us do that. To ultimately, what I hope is to build confidence in individuals to be able to enter spaces authentically themselves. And this is who I am because of my story, because of the background that I come from and the experiences that make me who I am. I am a value add to this space and this conversation. But it has to start with finding that story and understanding you have a story and believing that. And that is, I think, the hardest part. That not a lot of, I think, even educators sometimes fully understand, right? Because especially if we're working with a college access partner or a school that really wants their youth to go to these four-year colleges and write their college personal statements, and they have the GPAs for it. And it's like, plus me, come in and spend an hour helping our students write their story. It's like, hold on. You need to give them time to reflect and understand that they have that story, and they need to build the foundation first in order for them to have the confidence to write that story that can get them into that. So what I think as a society we need to understand is time and resources need to be dedicated to set that foundation first. And once that foundation is set, we then will have more confident storytellers that can go into spaces and write essays and articulate to the world who we are. But you have to dedicate time. And, our program, 5 hours of storytellers, 5 hours of writers before you're even writing that personal statement. It takes time to build that.
That's powerful. And I think that's closely connected to this idea of, what is an example of us, like you and I, Richard, like finding identity through story. And I look back at one of the elements in the Plus Me curriculum around settings. And I think people forget how important settings are to our identity, right? Like, what is the backdrop of our development? And one of the things that I discovered in my identity that I share with my kids is this idea of as a 5-6-year-old kid trying to remember like where I was, like what was I doing? And I remember just being in this little provincial little town in the country of Honduras and trying to recall what we were doing. And so by recalling my settings, my kids fell in love where I came from. Like, Dad, you were just walking around like barefoot out by the rivers, just like playing all day and not being indoors and just hanging with your cousins. And so that part of me was discovered by unpacking my story, like going back and reflecting. So settings to me was a key part in really holding up, finding my identity as an immigrant to this country, right? So I don't know if you got an example of like, what was an identity piece you discovered as you were wrestling and creating your story?
Yeah. I think, something that stood out for me is, understanding who I was raised by. And it was different, meaning I had my father's side of the family and my mother's side of the family that were very different, and understanding how both environments and both, being around both groups helped shape who I was. And because I was raised primarily on my mother's side of the family, understanding that was very much a low income working class household. They were not highly educated, and it was just a different experience at times than some interactions I had on my dad's side of the family, and trying to understand what that was like for me, and then how that shaped who I was and kind of some of the identities I embraced. So being, the son of an educator, and my grandmother worked in schools, even though they weren't teachers and they didn't have their degrees, they still are educators, and they still embraced youth and that passion. My mom was a one-on-one for an autistic student for her whole career. My grandma worked basically as like a secretary and security around a high school campus for her career. And it was like understanding, as they brought me to work with them, and as I was in just these environments, I understood that I'm an educator at heart. I have this desire for youth development. And I think, had I not understood that through my reflection of these people and how those interactions were as a kid, it wouldn't have maybe had me pursue becoming a TA, working at an after-school program, going to summer camps as a camp counselor, and then lead to this now career that I have. So those are just some moments that stick out in that reflection process that I wouldn't have really thought of had I not sat down and really gone back and uncovered it.
Awesome. And I think this next question related to this, Richard, and this is for the audience. Think of a time when you actually shared a story with a student or a group of students. Because one of the things, Richard, that I think we've all discovered in this room is that, and I used to say this, kids can smell inauthenticity a mile away. Like if you're not authentic, if you're not real, kids already know, like they're not about it. They're just passing through, right? So I guess the point of that statement is, what are ways and how can storytelling serve youth developers in connecting with young people? So how does it build authenticity in adults so that kids can then feel like it's a safe space to share my story, because X person, X teacher, coach, mentor, we know that they're real and they're being vulnerable with us. And so youth can then now feel like, all right, that's being modeled for us. So I think we can lean in and share a little bit about ourselves. What have you seen? How have you seen really make that connection between the youth developer and students in that sense of being authentic and real with our story? Right, so two parts here. One, for the audience, the time when you shared your story with youth, and then for you, Richard, how does authenticity help connect? Authenticity in our story, invite young people to do the same and be vulnerable.
Yeah, I can start with that second part, and then if hopefully anyone else wants to chime in. But I think being that model and being authentic and being vulnerable not only helps the students connect and realize, this is a real life example. But I think when we think about role models, it also like demystifies maybe sometimes this concept of like, I have to be perfect, or it has to look this way, right? I'm a role model and I can tell you all about the mistakes or the struggles that I had. And it releases this pressure, right? We think about the mental health wellness crisis right now, and it's like social media, you have to look a certain way, you have to be a certain way. This is how life has to be. Well, if we were more authentic and vulnerable to your point of, I'm fine. Well, no, this is actually what I'm going through. It would release a lot, I think, of this performative nature that as a society sometimes we have to put on. And it would, just create more authentic relationships and community where we're supporting one another and we're more aware when people need help. And I think a lot would change. It would be different for sure, but a lot would change, in my opinion, for the better.
Yeah, and I'll share, this is also something you talked about, social media and whatnot. And I think there's also this idea of storytelling as a competency for our own professional advancement. There's a narrative, there's a real thing right now that we've discounted people's lived experience as a credential, right? As a way to say you've got experience, you have expertise, you are what we need, because we've discounted lived experiences for some other type of credential, right? A professional credential. And so I've come to really embrace this idea that storytelling actually is a way to advance our own careers. It's a way to have people go, wow, they've got something to offer. And I think social media for me has been a place where, I've never been a LinkedIn person before coming over to Mizzen. I never really did anything there. But little by little, I started looking at LinkedIn as a place where people are actually sharing more authentically, especially after the death of George Floyd, especially in the Black community. I started seeing more and more real talk around what people are experiencing in the workplace, right? It wasn't just sharing their great successes. It wasn't just talking about their promotions. They were really talking about institutionalized racism. They were talking about equity. They were talking about trauma in the workplace and the need for self-care. And all of that was being developed by these like snippets of stories that were being shared on LinkedIn from a professional vantage point. So when you think about professionalism, Richard, and our own development in our practice and in our craft, how does storytelling really help us just be more effective and more compelling in the work that we do as professionals?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's so much benefit and value add that these storytelling resources and tools can provide you in your workplace, in your personal life. And it's kind of going back to thinking about culture, right? If you think about the culture that you want to create and what you want the environment to be like and how you want people to maybe feel a certain way while they're there, it has to be modeled, right? And there are some work environments or some places that maybe are not going to embrace this as much because they may view it a certain way, right? If we are more vulnerable, if we do talk about certain things that maybe we're not supposed to talk about at work, it might affect the effectiveness of our work. I've heard that before. But, I always argue, like, if we're able to show up authentically as ourselves and we're able to know more about people, the culture that you're creating, the team connection will result in more effective, just whatever you're striving for. It will align you more. It will allow you to see each other as humans more, and colleagues. So I think there's a lot there, and it is different. And I think in the youth development space, we want to continuously encourage, those that are engaging with students to understand they have a story, find that story and share it, but give themselves the time and the space to do that, because it's not just you have lived experience, you have a story, now go interact with our students. It's giving the adults that time for themselves to kind of put that together in a structured environment can go a long way. So I think at the leadership at the top, you have to be willing to go there and you have to model it yourself. And then you'll see the impact kind of going down the road of how hopefully they follow in your footsteps and embrace showcasing their wins and celebrating those great moments, as well as the things that they're struggling with.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. I want to go back. Actually, Haley made a point to talk about celebration, right? So storytelling as a way to celebrate, because especially culturally speaking, Richard, right? When I look at the Latino culture, we don't celebrate our wins. it's like, it's even something, you know, I remember comedian George Lopez always used to do stand-up comedy to make fun of Latinos. Like when we share stories of success, they're like, oh, nice, it's about time. You know, it's like we almost get sarcastic and kind of take jabs at each other for celebrating successes and being verbal and sharing those things outright. So what is the role of storytelling in just celebrating the successes of our lives? What does that do for us as individuals and as a community? What's the impact?
Yeah, a lot of us don't think we have accomplishments, you know, and if you think about youth, a lot of times society has these accomplishments as graduating from high school or college, buying a home, getting married, getting a car, getting this amazing job. And when you're 14 or 15, you can't even do it mostly any of those things. So it's like, oh, I don't have any accomplishments in my life. So it's reframing that and understanding these small things that you've done are accomplishments. And if we start to frame it that way in our minds, it's going to be more of kind of a growth mindset, positive element where you're understanding like, oh, these are things that I've done well, and it can uplift that confidence, right? So it's, oh, you know, I helped my friend with their homework today. That's an accomplishment. Oh, I recycled something today. That's an accomplishment. Oh, I made that basket out during PE. It's just these small things can help shift. And when we're understanding that these small things can then grow into larger accomplishments, if we're consistent and if we're working towards our goals, it can change mindsets. So, and then those need to be celebrated, right? So when we go into classrooms, like, what have you accomplished? More students have nothing to say. And when we get them to uncover, and when one student will say what maybe they thought was a silly accomplishment, others will be like, oh, well, I did that too. And yay, we can connect on that. And it just, it again, takes off that pressure of needing to fit into what society says and gives them permission to be themselves and to be proud of who they are. And then get them to dream. Well, what other accomplishments do I want in my life? Then they can see themselves as, where do I want my story going? And they understand, okay, well, if these were moments from my past, what can moments in my future look like? Oh, I have control over that in some respect. Oh, that's exciting. And it can then just build this confidence for an individual to move forward in their life.
That's awesome, Richard. Wow, that's a great perspective to share with us on the power of storytelling. I know we've got a few minutes left, so I know there's a couple of questions in the chat that are connected to previous points that we were making, one on identity development. So Megan, I don't know if you want to come off mute and maybe, I don't know if we've answered that question for you, or folks, if you have any questions for us from what you've heard. But Megan, I'll kind of put you on the spot to see if you want to expand or maybe change your question a little bit.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for the space, Carlos. And thank you so much for doing this and sharing this. The whole time I've just been thinking, wow, I wish I had this when I was a youth, like growing up, right? And better late than never, of course. But my question was kind of geared towards, you know, when we think about identity, at least for me, a lot of the times I think about what has happened in my past that has defined who I am now. And I'm wondering that, you know, the work that you're doing with the youth, putting myself in this position, if I had had this conversation when I was younger, I wonder how that would have empowered me to really understand and take ownership of my identity development, you know, the positive reinforcements that you're talking about. And so, you know, you've been sharing your story for, you said, over a decade now. So how has that changed who you developed and how your identity, how you see your identity?
Yeah, no, it's shifted a lot, you know. I think, you know, as a founder and executive director of an organization, going from starting this idea, reading Nonprofit for Dummies, thinking that I can make an impact in the world, to 10 years later, having a team and a significantly large impact throughout this county, I've had to shift how I view myself and how I identify myself in a space, you know. And I think, you know, there's a lot of my identities as a Latino, as a first-generation college student, transfer student, as a gay man. I felt like a lot of these intersectionalities have made me feel like I'm not enough sometimes in these spaces, right? I don't belong in some of these spaces. I'm not taken seriously in some of these spaces. So I've had to just through a lot of just the storytelling and self-reflection work, grow that muscle in my mind of resilience. And I do belong here, and I will continuously show up and, you know, follow this vision that I've set. It's helped. And I think by constantly tapping into some of those moments and sharing them and reliving that resilience over and over again, it helps me move forward in that path. Whereas sometimes I think if we don't see ourselves as the hero of our stories or as someone who has really overcome a lot, we can be more on that I talk about the negative voice and the positive voice in my story. Like, we can then just maybe lean more into that negative side and not take that risk and not put ourselves out there. And it can just be a ripple effect that can go in maybe a direction that won't serve your life moving forward. So I think that's how it shaped my identity. And I think working with youth, what I've loved is just, you know, I've been out of high school, you know, 15, 20 years. High school kids are different. And when it comes to identities, they're in a whole different ballgame when it comes to embracing and accepting and exploring and just, this is who they are. And I love seeing that, which then allows them in our storytelling process, I think, to really embrace it even more than I think had we come into programs 20 years ago. They would have embraced it. I just think it still would have been, is it okay? Can I do this? It's less of that, which is great to see.
Awesome. Great question. Thank you, Megan. I also know Haley threw in a question around, and I've seen this a few times. What are some prompts or resources, whether it's around the aspect of storytelling around successes or just in general? Yes, there's a +me curriculum and there's resource. What are other ways or easy prompts, as Haley stated, where we can get folks to step out and really start sharing their story, right? What are some things, Richard, that you would recommend as we close out?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you just write down the 4 elements, so characters, settings, events, and lessons, and you think of basic questions under each, that can get you moving forward, right? So characters, who's someone who helped raise you? Who's your favorite teacher? Who is someone you go to for advice? Who is someone who makes you smile, right? Settings, where did you grow up? Where's your family from? Where do you spend your free time? Where do you like to go after school? Where do you not like to go after school, right? It gets questions. Events. What's a happy moment you remember? What's a obstacle you recently overcame? You know, just all these different simple questions that can fall into these 4 categories. As we start to ask our audiences them and we get them to share, it will bring out more and more stories. So I think the advice is just ask questions that fall into these 4 areas and answer them yourself and model and get more and more stories to be unearthed and to be shared. That's what's key, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, and you're going to find more of this. And again, this is for the audience that will see this in the recording, right? Because you've seen this already on the chat, but go to plusmeproject.org, correct, Richard? Is that the right URL? Plusmeproject.
Yep, the plusmeproject.org. Yeah.
The plusmeproject.org, where you'll see a breakdown of this. And it's been a huge impact in my life. I've been able to really connect and tap into my own identity and experiences and story through sitting down and breaking each of those things down in my life. And I've used those in keynotes. I've used those in social media posts. I've used those in one-on-one time with people as a way to connect. I've used those to connect with young people and kind of hear their story. So much opens up because of this idea of storytelling and identity development. And Richard, I learned that from you and your work, and it's really been transformative for me. And I think that's what you'll find as an individual, when you tap into your story, it is truly transformational on a personal and collective level. The impacts definitely reverberate to those around you. So Richard, any closing thoughts here as we wrap up our campfire time?
No, just grateful to share this space and reiterating the idea. You have a story, your story matters. Take some time out of your life to explore it and pursue it and share it, because it will make a difference. So I'm grateful. Reach out if you'd like to connect with us, but I look forward to staying connected with hopefully all of you and doing this great work together. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. It's 10 o'clock. Well, Pacific Coast on the dot. Thanks for joining us, and until our next campfire. Hopefully you get to experience a real campfire this summer, and we will hopefully be back in touch. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.